Hello everyone and welcome to the Edureka webinar on the topic refactoring React components from ES5 to ES6. I am Vipul Jain. I have 7 years of experience. So let's get started. So the agenda of this particular webinar is as follows. First we'll talk about the introduction of React components. Then we'll talk about the component structure using ES5 class, which is the previous version of the latest class library, that is ES6. We'll see what are the various pros and cons of the ES5 class along with the code examples with the demo. Then we'll talk about the benefits of ES6 class, that is a new version of the ECMA script version. We'll also talk about the advantages of ES6 class, and then we'll see a demo of ES6 restructuring using a code example and how we can refactor an ES5 class to a ES6 class. And finally, we will see a very basic application of Tic Tac Toe program. So before getting started, I am assuming that all the participants or all the viewers of this particular webinar are having a basic knowledge of React.js. Since this is an advanced topic of React, that's why I'm assuming that all the concepts related to React, for example, what is a component, what is props, what are states, lifecycle, events, etc., are known. But still continue with the introduction of React components, a very basic components to the React. So everything in React is a component. So components lets you split the UI into independent and reusable pieces. And we can think about each piece in isolation. So each piece or each component in React works in isolations altogether. So conceptually, components are like JavaScript functions. They accept arbitrary inputs, and those inputs are called props in React. And they return React elements describing what should appear on the screen. So each component basically it generates a HTML which is rendered by the DOM, and DOM here is document object model. Now what are the benefits of using components? Components enables the user with a modular approach, where small pieces of code are isolated, which enhance the reusability and the readability of the code. Also, while refreshing the page, only the components in which the changes have been occurred got updated, which is a concept of virtual DOM, which has been introduced in React.js. So let's talk a little more about the components and props. So as I said, components lets you split the UI into independent and reusable pieces. They accept the arbitrary inputs, which are called props. Now there are two types of components. One is a functional component and the other is the class component. The functional component is the one where we use functions, and the class component is one where we use classes. So as you can see, here is an example of the functional component where we are declaring a function called welcome, and it is taking the input parameter which are called props. Likewise, we have a class component. So the class component, it extends React.component, which is a feature of ES6 class, which we are going to see, and additional feature also which we are going to see and discuss later. Now how we render a component. So when React sees an element representing a user-defined component, it passes the JS6 attributes to this component in terms of props. So first of all, what we do when we talk about the component, we call React DOM.render method with the welcome name equal to, here you can see Vipul. So the name of the function is welcome. React calls this welcome component with name Vipul as the property or the props. This welcome component reacts hello Vipul, which is written over here hello, and the props.name. So this name props.name and the component attribute which is name should match. And finally, React DOM efficiently updates the DOM, and React DOM, when I'm talking about, it is the virtual DOM which efficiently updates the DOM to match the hello Vipul or the H1 tag. Now let's see the very basic hello world example. So before going into any the coding part or the practical scenarios, I always use this JS bin. This JS bin is nothing, if you can Google it, it is nothing but a collaborative JavaScript debugging app. You can say it is a collaborative web development debugging tool. So going to this JS bin, if you go to this JS bin, you can have the HTML, CSS, the React.js where you can write the React code. You can see the output. Now I'll start with the basic HTML. This is the HTML where I've included the the required React libraries. And I have a div element where I'll be displaying the output. And this div element is having an ID as root. Now let's talk about the very basic code example of React.js. It is saying where hello message react.create class. This is again a ES5 class. Since we are talking about in this webinar refactoring from ES5 to ES6. So let's first understand the ES5 code examples, which we can refactor to the ES6 examples. So here it is saying a function render. Render is the required function which renders the output on the screen. So it is returning hello this.props.message. And in the React DOM.render, it takes two arguments. First argument is your component and the other argument is the place where you want to display the output. So my component name is here hello message, which is this hello messages, message equal to world. Hello I have already returned as hard coded. So in the output, it is printing as hello world. So this is a very basic example of using a component in React.js. Now let's go further. Now component structure in Facebook, as we all know that Facebook and other applications are using React. The other applications, if I'm talking about, these are like Instagram, WhatsApp, Uber, Yahoo, all these applications nowadays are using React. After 2009, in 2011, it came as open source project, and further in 2013, it came to the open source project, the React.js, which is a Facebook library. Now in the Facebook, we have search bar, notifications bar, add post, chat window. These are the multiple features which work on React in Facebook. Now component is structured using ES5 syntax. What happens in ES5? So in ES5, we have React.create class and a method called getInitialState. These two are combined as functions and component is rendered. So in ES5, we use React.create class method to define the React components. Just like we saw the example before, we declared a simple hello message component using the React.create class. Var keyword is used to declare variable whose values can be manipulated. This is a very important point to note here that in ES5, we are using var, which works as a global declaration of the variable. And then third one is the method used to define the initial state values. So we can get the initial state in getInitialState method. Now here I have one point which I want to make. So when writing code in React, should we use React.create class, which is ES5 specification, or the ES6 class syntax, or maybe neither? React can be written perfectly well in ES5 or ES6. So the whole agenda of this webinar is not compelling you to work only with ES6. You can very well work with ES5 classes as well. It is just like two ways to do the same thing. So React traditionally provided, you can say that traditional programming of React is React.create class method to create the component classes. And it released a small syntax sugar update to allow for better use with ES6 modules. And now it is extending to React.create component, which extends the component class instead of calling the create class itself. Now each component in ES5 class, as we saw in the demo, each component has a render function which tells the DOM what needs to be displayed on the screen. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of ES5 syntax. Now what are the pros of ES5 syntax? It has the browser support, which is a huge plus. Since ES6 it's very new, many browsers not supporting as of now the ES6 code. Explicit binding of this keyword is not needed. In ES6 class, we have explicit bounding of this, which is required, and the latest version of React, which is 16.0 and before 15.5. So explicit binding is not required. No need to use any transpiler like Babel. Babel is just like a transpiler, or you can say JavaScript compiler. So there is no need. Now, what are the cons? We have to use commas to separate methods within the classes. So there is a provision, or there is a way where you can have multiple functions or methods which needs to be separated by comma, which we'll see in one of the demo. The one of the most important cons with related to ES5 class, I'll say that the code is very lengthy. It affects the readability and maintainability of the code in React.js when we talk about ES5 classes. That also we'll see in one of the demo very quickly. Now let's talk about the demo now. Now we are going to build an application. Okay. I'll show you how we can build an application using ES5 and ES6 class. What are the various differences? How we can refactor it. But what we are going to do in this demo, just a quick overview of that. In the demo example, we are going to create three buttons. One is the single click button, which on a single click will increase the counter. Let's say from 0, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on. We will have another button, which is the double click button, which will increase the counter on double click of the mouse. And we will have finally the third button, a hover button, which will just increase or increment the counter by hovering of the mouse. So these buttons will increment their counter when a particular mouse gesture or event is made, and then the count will be displayed in the output screen. We'll also demonstrate the use of props to display a message on the screen. So let's talk about that how we can create the React components using ES5 code examples. These are the various code snippets in the PPT which are included. And after this, I'll show you the live demo that how we can use this. So first of all, what we are doing. So here what we are creating a component class in React using create class method. This is the ES5 syntax where button equal to react.create class. So we are creating a component using create class method. Then we are using var keyword is used to declare the variables. Since this is a var keyword, we are using it to declare the variables here. The state variables are getting initialized in the get initial state method. And since you can see if it is a function or a method, there needs to be a comma separated. It's a function which is used to validate the prop types. There is a comma which is added to end of the each function. Now, continuing to this, we have another function which is called increCount. This is a function to increment the counter. And at last, we have a render function. Now, these two functions again separated by a comma over here. Each component in React has a render function which returns the HTML to the DOM. I repeat, each component means every component, whatever components you are declaring in your React.js code, it needs to have a render function. Minimum of one function should be there, and all the other functions needs to be separated by comma. Then this keyword is used to refer to the props value. As you can see over here, if I have a props value which I'm passing to a component, then this keyword is used to refer to that prop value. So this .props.name will be used to refer to the props value. Now again, continuing to this code, we have three components. We create more component classes. This D button is for the double click of the button, react.create class. If I go to the previous slides, if you see here, this is a button which will show the increment counter on a single click. Now this is again a component, the second component, react.create class, D button, which will show the increment counter on the double click of the button. Again, it has the increment counter. It has another event called on double click. So it says button on double click. We define our increment function over here inside each button component. And finally, we have one more component for the hovering of the button. So as the number of components increase, as you can see, as I said, the code is getting lengthy in ES5. So as the number of components are increasing in ES5 code, it is very difficult from a readability and maintainability standpoint to maintain the ES5 code because the complexity in ES5 code or the class is getting increased. So for the hover button same or likewise, we have get initial state function. Then we have increCount function. All these functions are separated by comma. And finally, we have the render function, which is returning a button, and on mouse movement of the mouse or the cursor, the increment counter will work. And finally, we define another component, which is a compo, which is used to render the output to the DOM. So this is the main component. This is the component which will be used to render the output to the DOM, because the previous three components which we created, the first one was the button, the second was the D button, and the third one was the hover button. So all these three components we are going to use in our main component, which is used to render output to the DOM. So what we are doing over here, let's see. So this is a component. We are creating it using react.create class, which is ES5 syntax. And here I am using only one function, which is render, since it is the only required function in an ES5 class. So what we are returning over here, we are returning three devs having three buttons. And finally, I am saying that react dom.render, render this component wherever I want to render in my particular div on the page. So this is a complete code example, step-by-step code example. I'll repeat very quickly once again that what we did, how we started. We started by creating a component for a button that will be a single click button because we are using here on click event of that button. Then we created another second component or another component for the double click of the button, and we used on double click event for that. Then we created third component, which is hover btn for showing the increment counter when the user will hover on that particular button. And we are using here on mouse move event. And finally, we created the fourth and the final component, which will be used to render output to the DOM, in which we are calling all the other three components. And this component is getting called using react dom.render. And the second argument for this is where I want to display. So before going into the what are the benefits of the ES6, let's see a demo of this particular example. Okay, so again, I am in the JS bin. The HTML remains the same. In HTML, I am having the root element where I'll be displaying the output. Let's see. Whatever we saw in the PPT, we will see in this JS bin that what we have written. So here is the first component. So this is the first component, the button. It is having three functions: get initial state, separated by comma, 𝐸5 and then render. Render is the most important one. In render, we are creating a button with an on-click event. The second component which we are creating is for the double click, that is the D button. So this is the second component, the same functionality. One important thing, as you can see that in getInitialState, the initial state of the object is count, the property count is 0. And in the 𝐸5 function, what we are doing is that we are increasing the counter by using this.state.count plus 1. Now the third component, the hover button. The hover button component is this, which is having again the same functionality, only the other difference is that we are using a different event for the hover button, which is on mouse move. And finally, we are bundling all these three components in another component, the fourth component, with the name compo, react.create class, all the three components which we created earlier getting bundled in the fourth component. And finally, we are calling this fourth component to show in our DOM using react DOM.render, which takes two arguments. First is the component name and the other is the place where we want to display. So that is how we wrote the code using ES5 syntax. And let's see the output. Now, if you can see the output, it is displaying me the three buttons. If I click over here, I'm clicking single time, so it is getting incremented. If I click again, it says 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now, this was the first component for the single click of the button. Now, if I talk about the second button, if I click it single, nothing is happening. The reason being, we are using it for the double click of the button, and we are using an event called on double click. So let's double click. So if I'm double clicking on it, it's getting incremented. Wow. So from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, I'm doing it double click, from 2 to 3 and so on. And the last one. So last one was the hover button. See, whenever I am hovering, it is getting incremented by 1. So that is how we write the code in ES5. So I'll repeat from this bin that whatever I have written. So we wrote a component with a button for the single click, then a double click component, and then a hover of the mouse component, and then the main component, which will bundle up all the other three components. And finally, we are calling using react DOM.render whatever we want to display on our DOM. So let's go back to PPT again, and then we'll talk about now the ES6. What are the benefits of ES6 components? This was all about till here. It was about the ES5. I'm assuming that you have now the fair understanding of ES5 class or ES5 components, which includes mainly specifically the react.create class from where you start writing the code, and then you call the getInitialState where you set the initial state of the component, and then finally there is a render function where you write whatever you want to render on the DOM. So that was all about the ES5. We'll come back to ES5 very quickly. Now let's talk about the ES6 components. Because since the main agenda of this webinar to see the ES6 component and how we can refactor our existing code, which is written as of now in 15.5 version of React.js using react.create class, and how we can refactor it to ES6 syntax. So what are the main benefits? Let's talk about, first of all, the first benefit is the compactness. The ES6 components are very compact. They are JavaScript centric. When I say JavaScript centric, they are not API centric. We'll see that. Then there is use of const and let keywords. I'll talk about a little later of these keywords which has been introduced now. And ES6 components, they use pure functions. So there is no need of commas to separate the functions. And now the stateless components can be converted to pure functions, leading to a minimal code size. And then more specifically, ES6 adopts a JavaScript centric approach. Now we are passing the state values inside the constructor. So this is more of a JavaScript approach and not the API approach, which we used to do in the ES5. And now the component is now a function. This is very important to note here. Component is now a function. Prop ties are a property on the function itself. This is very important. As I said that the where keyword in ES5 was globally scoped. So now the global scope where keyword in ES5 is replaced with const and let, which are block scoped in ES6. This is very important. We use const for constant values and let is used for variable values. And const supports immutability. That is because it is constant, so its value cannot be updated. In React with ES6, we are able to abstract the state away from our functional components. For this, we utilize the stateless functional components, which is as simple as the pure functions or the props in and props out. So before going to the demo, let's talk more about the advantages of the ES6 components. So let's talk more about the advantages of ES6 components in detail. So ES6 specifically, I'll say that is the 6th edition of the ECMS script, which got standardized in 2015. It brings many engrossing features that were not seen in the previous version like ES5. For example, the let, as I mentioned, the let and the const keywords, and they are the blocked scope declarations. They are not prone to the common errors which are caused by misunderstanding in the code itself. ES6 is able to tackle most of the code language's shortcomings, which are there in other frameworks also, for example, TypeScript and CoffeeScript. So let's go one by one. What are the basic advantages of ES6? So I'll talk about the arrows first of all. Arrows are the functions. These are the functions shorthand using the equal to and greater than syntax. There is a similarity between the syntactical features of C#, CoffeeScript, and ES6. Both statement block bodies and expression bodies are supported by them, which return the value of the expression. At the same time, arrows share the same lexical this as their surrounding code. This is very important. So ES6 is different, a little bit different, because it has introduced a new syntax, which I'll see in the demo, which needed a transformation extension in the JavaScript. Now let's talk about classes. In ES6, if I talk about class, having a single declarative pattern makes the class pattern painless thing to use, and it boosts interoperability. They are very simple to write over the prototype because they are very simple to write as compared to the prototype based O pattern, object oriented pattern. So inheritance, instance, and static methods are supported by classes, which makes ES6 more good version, or I'll say the perfect version of the JavaScript. Then we have enhanced object literals. So what is the purpose of object literal? First of all, the purpose of the object literal is to support setting the prototype at the construction. So when combined, they bring different object literal and class declaration close together and benefits object-based design from some of the conveniences probably. Yeah. So let's talk about modules. How ES6 is advantageous in terms of modules. So in ES6, modules provide a course to load and manage dependency through the new keywords which has been introduced in ES6, which are import-export keywords. Yeah. Even after having good solution like third-party libraries in ES5, there was a problem called modularity. Modularity remains an important concept for large applications. ES6, it allows smooth interoperability with existing JS module systems like Node.js, CommonJS, etc. It has become a standardized protocol for sharing the libraries, and it also has easy asynchronous external loading with the external libraries. Now I'll talk about the block scoping. Scoping becomes a very important affair for developers who has background of C#, Java, or maybe C++, yes. So when I talk about scoping, ES5, the previous version of ES6, it lacked a very essential feature of block scoping, which is now declared as comparison to ES6. Though need became the mother of the invention, as we know, and block scoping came into the scenario in ES6. So ES6 emerged out with this feature, block scoping, using the let and const keyword, of course. Now I'll talk about promises. So ES6 is a promising language where there are asynchronous operations and there are promises to handle the results and the errors. So there is very good, you can say, improved readability and very good error handling as well. So many languages or libraries, I will say JavaScript libraries nowadays are using promises. For example, let's say RSVP.js, AngularJS, all these are using promises. So these were all about the advantages of ES6. Now let's go to the demo once again. Now in this demo, again, I'm using the same HTML. Now this demo is specific to the ES6 class syntax. It's very important to understand the syntax first of all. We'll see the demo that how our ES5 class, which is here, which was using React.create class, has now been converted to class extends React.component. This is very important to understand that what we did in the ES6 code, and then we'll see that what are the various important things which needs to be done to refactor a ES5 class to a ES6 class. So let's start. So what we have done, what are the changes? First of all, the let keyword. Earlier we were using the var keyword. So var has been replaced by let in ES6. And now React.create class has been replaced by, because that has been deceased and deprecated, I'll say. So it has been replaced by class extends React.component. Now here what I'm doing a constructor. I'm creating a constructor with a super keyword and initializing the state in constructor itself. At the same time, I have one function which is incrementing the counter and a render function. A very simple code. Now I am creating three components over here. Let's say button for the single click, for the hover button, and for the double click. and that's it. And then I'm just calling my base component, that is the base comp which I declared as a class, and then I'm calling all the other three components. And finally, this is my fourth component which I'm declaring, which is saying comp click, and then in the react DOM.render, I'm calling the fourth component along with the second argument. And as you can see, if I'm clicking a single time, it is incrementing. The output of the code remains the same, but the way I have written the code in ES5, which was very lengthy, it was not maintainable, it was not readable, the readability was not good, which has been improved tremendously in ES6 class syntax. So when I'm clicking once, it is getting incremented. When I'm clicking twice, it is getting incremented. When I'm hovering over the button, the counter is getting incremented. Now, how this is all working, we'll see again. So let's start from here. So what are the basic differences between ES5 and ES6 class? This is very important to understand. So as we saw that ES5, it calls react.create class with an object. And ES6, on the other hand, it uses class extending react.component. In ES5, create class accepts an initial state using the getInitialState function that gets called once when the component is mounted. Instead, ES6 class, it uses the constructor. After calling super, it sets the state directly, which we saw in the demo. Now, when I talk about the binding of the functions, with create class, it's very easy. Every property that is a function is automatically bounded by React. And in the bounding of function, when I talk about ES6 class, it's a little bit trickier. Functions are not auto-bound. We have to explicitly auto-bound the function. So with create class, define prop types and default props as properties. We define prop types and default props as properties on the object which we pass. While with the ES6 class, these become the properties of the class itself. There is a very big difference over here. So they need to be tagged or tackled onto the class after it is defined. So let's see one by one what are the differences between ES5 and ES6. First of all, the syntax differences, as we saw that it uses react.create class, and here we have class with contacts extends react.component. So in ES6, we are using basically a constructor where we need to call the super to pass the props. We are using a super where we need to pass the props to the react.component. We now create a class. We are not using react.create class. Now we have to create a class and extend from react.component instead of accessing react.create class directly. This is first difference, or you can say the syntactic difference between ES5 and ES6. Now let's talk about the other differences. The prop types and the get default props. In ES5, this is the ES5 code and this is the ES6 code on the right hand side. In left hand side in the ES5 code, in react.create class version, the prop types, as you can see over here in the code, the prop type is a property. The prop type is a property, is an object in which we can declare the type for each prop. The get default props, the get default prop property is a function that is returning an object to create the initial property. In ES6 uses prop types as a property on the actual class instead of a property as part of the create class definition object. The get default props has now been changed to just an object property on the class called default props. As you can see over here, the get default props is nowhere. It has now changed to just an object property on the class called default props, as it is no longer a get function. It's just an object. Earlier it was a get function. It was returning something, but now it is not a get function. It's just an object. This is the second difference. Now let's talk about the third difference. This is again very important, which is state differences. In ES5, for declaring the initial state, we are having a function called getInitialState in ES5, which simply returns an object. Which simply, because it's a function, it should return something. It simply returns an object of the initial state values. But in ES6, the getInitialState function is deprecated, and now we declare all state as a simple initialization property in the constructor itself. So it is more of a JavaScript and less of an API-driven functionality in ES6. This is the fourth difference, the this differences. So react.create class automatically binds this values correctly. So as you can see, this dot handle click and the values get binded. But there is a trickier code in ES6. With ES6 classes, properties of the class do not automatically bind the React class instance. There are two ways in which we can bind the right context, which we'll see in the next slide. So binding the context in ES6. So as you can see over here, what I'm doing is I'm creating a class with the react.component, extending react.component, having a constructor which is taking properties. And there is a function called handle click. So what I'm doing is I'm using a bind function over here, this dot handle click dot bind this. This is one of the way of binding the context in ES6. This is the second way. Now binding the context inside the constructor. Here we have binded the context outside the constructor. and here we have binded the context inside the constructor itself. So we could change the context because we have changed the context of this.handleClick inside the constructor. So to avoid the inline repetition of the code, and it seems that this is a better approach if moving to the syntax to avoid touching JSX at all. So what we are doing here, that there is a constructor and we are calling the bind function, bind property inside this constructor itself. So this is one of the way. Now mixins. Mixins, if I talk about, mixins are not supported anymore in ES6 classes. They were used in ES5 syntax, which takes an array of the values, and these can then extend the component class. They are no more supported in ES6 syntax. Now let's go to our, so we have seen the demo of the ES6. So these are again, so whatever we have seen, that the demo of the ES6 class, that now we are using let, we are using constructor, we are declaring the state in the constructor itself, and instead of react.create class, we are using class which extends react.component. So this is all the recap of whatever we have seen just now in the demo and in the other slides. So you can see here that the function keyword is dropped in render. We are using object spread operator to load all state variable at once. Const is used to declare the constants, and prop types, as you can see here, it is seen as a built-in property. It is not returning any value. It is the built-in value of the button, or the built-in value or the property, instead of a return value. Now, just like we created in the demo the two increment counters for the two buttons, here we are using for the hover button and the D button. This is the same code which we saw in the demo. Now we have understanding of the ES5 and ES6 components and the classes. Now we'll create a very simple application with the Tic Tac Toe with React using ES6 features. And in this Tic Tac Toe program, we will use arrow functions, classes, let, and const elements or statements heavily, because these are the features of ES6. So we'll create three components basically for the board. One will be for the board, one will be for the square, and one will be for the game. So for each player turn, we'll shift between X and O as we generally do in Tic Tac Toe. So we'll start with the 9 empty squares which are rendered by the board component, because there are three components, as I said, board, square, and game, to display this Tic Tac Toe program. So we have used the pure function, which is a stateless, a square function, which we'll see in the demo just after this, and which receives the prop values from its parent board. So the parent of the square is board, and it notifies the board when it is clicked. So board component basically tells each square what to display. That is why the state is residing within the board component. So there is a function called calculate winner, which is required to find the winner. We'll pass all the square combinations 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All these are the square combination, and then on which we can loop to identify the matching squares. And then finally we'll return null if any condition fails, else we return X or O. So there is a function we have seen which is calculate winner function. Then we have handle click function, and where we manipulate the state variable. Then finally we use ES6 let to declare a variable status. Let status, which prints the winner in case a player wins or indicates the next player turn. And finally, inside the board render function, we will be returning 9 squares using the render square method. See this from a demo perspective, then we will have a better understanding that how it is working. So as I said, there will be a function called square. So this is a component called board, and this is rendering, and this is a component called game, which is having the handle click and the other functions as well. And as I said about that, there will be different combinations of the board, where we are using the calculate winner function. And finally, we are calling the React DOM.render, where we are displaying the game component. So this is the game component, as you can see over here in the code. This is the game component. So if I look at the output for this, I am using a particular CSS also, yes, and HTML remains the same which we are using. So I am using a particular CSS to render the squares over the DOM. And so let's play this game. Let's start the game. Let's click on one of the cell. I clicked, it says move 1. I clicked again, it says, oh, this is the move 2. Let's say I click this here, this is the move 3, this is move 4, and let's say this is move 5, and let's say the winner is O. So once we have the winner, you are not able to click anywhere on the screen. If you want to play it again, you have to click on the game start. So in the 6 moves, it is telling us that in how many moves the player O or the winner or the player O has won tic-tac-toe game. So let's see once again, let's start the game again. So if I click on game start, it says X, O, this is the second player chance, then again X. If I place O over here and if I place X over here, so it says the winner is X now, because X has completed this particular cells, this particular line. So in the 5 moves, we have the winner as X. So that is how this tic-tac-toe program works. So again, I'm repeating what we have done. So we'll see this using the slides, what we did in the basic tic-tac-toe program. I'll start again with the basic functionality, what we did. Okay, I'll start with here. So what we did, we start with 9 empty squares, and then when the first player is clicking on the square, the component re-renders state value to X. So he will see an X in the grid. So this is a 3x3 grid where the person will see X or O in the grid. Then what we did, we created pure function with the name square to define the square component. And this function, it receives prop values from its parent board. So the parent is board. It notifies board when it is clicked. Then what we did, we push state into the board component and fill the squares with null values for beginning. So basically we have created a component with the name board. And then we are passing down two props from board to square value and on click. Then we have a function calculate winner, which is used to find the winner. As you can see over here, we have a function calculate winner. This is the calculate winner function, which is used to find that who is the winner, whether the winner is X or whether the winner is O. Then we have multiple other functions to handle click, which returns either the winner or the next player. Then finally, we have a variable with using the let, we have declaring a variable status, which prints the winner, that whether the winner is X or whether the winner is O. Now, if you can see inside the board render function, we will be returning the 9 squares using the render square method. So these are the 9 squares 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which are actually rendering on the output screen or on the DOM. So all we need is to make 3 rows. Since we have to make 3 rows, that's why I implemented some CSS. And then we are good to go. And finally, we have third component, which is the game component, which is getting finally displayed, which is used to render the board component. So in the game, we are displaying the board component. As you can see over here, we are displaying the board component. So that was all about the refactoring of ES5 to ES6. And we also talked about the advantages of ES6 in detail. So I just want to quickly repeat that what are the basic differences or how you can refactor your code from an existing ES5 to ES6. So I'll just quickly repeat that what are the basic differences. So the first and foremost, let's get started again very quickly. First difference, syntax difference. No more react.create class as it was there in ES5. Now we are going to use react.component or specifically class contacts or the class name which extends react.component. So this is the first difference. The second difference, the prop types and get default props. The prop types property, which is the object in which we can declare the type for each prop. So the property on the actual, now we are declaring this prop types inside the constructor. Now we have a constructor over here. The third difference, the state differences. Earlier in ES5, we have a method called getInitialState where we used to declare the state, the initial state. And ES6, the getInitialState has been deprecated, and now we declare all state in a single or a simple initialization property in the constructor itself. So I'll say the ES6 is more of a JavaScript driven API and not of API driven now. The other difference is related to the this differences, that this dot handle click, which we used to put in the render function, now we can put it in the constructor. So I'll say that ECMS script is an emerging star, which is going to encompass and use all the other libraries and frameworks with the course of time. And more of production libraries and frameworks we use to create our applications are going to return using ES6 syntax probably. So at the end, I want to conclude that yes, Facebook does suggest the future removal of this react.create class completely in favor of the ES6 classes. But for now, use whatever makes sense to you because they are both just syntax with different semantics that do the same things. At the end, they are both classes. Yes, ES5 and ES6 at the end, they are both classes. So thank you. Thanks a lot for watching this webinar. Thank you.